The Atlantic wind carried salt and cordite across the cliffs of Omerville. Major Friedrich von der Heide stood at the edge of a stone farmhouse, binoculars pressed against his face, watching the horizon dissolve into chaos. The sea had turned gray-green with invasion craft, thousands of them, stretching from Sword Beach to Utah like iron locusts devouring the coastline. Behind him, a junior officer vomited into the grass. The sound was wet and pitiful. Von der Heide did not turn. He simply lowered the binoculars and whispered a single word into the dawn. Zu spät. Too late. For months, the German High Command had known the invasion was coming. They had fortified the Atlantic Wall with millions of tons of concrete, laid 500,000 mines along the beaches, and positioned entire panzer divisions within striking distance of the coast. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had walked these cliffs, inspecting gun emplacements and calculating angles of fire. He had warned Berlin, the invasion must be stopped at the water's edge, or it cannot be stopped at all. But on that gray June morning, as the first American Rangers scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc and British commandos stormed Gold Beach, every German officer with eyes to see understood the same terrible truth. They were too late. Not by hours or days, but by years. The war had already turned, and they had not seen it turning. The German officers who witnessed D-Day were not fools. They were men trained in the Prussian military tradition, heirs of von Clausewitz and von Moltke, schooled in the doctrine of maneuver warfare and decisive battle. Many had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. They had seen entire nations collapse under the weight of blitzkrieg. They had watched their armies sweep across Europe like a steel tide, swallowing cities and redrawing maps. And so, in the spring of 1944, even as the Allies massed their forces in southern England, many German commanders clung to a dangerous belief that when the invasion came, they would meet it with the same ferocity that had brought them victory before, that the Atlantic Wall would hold, that the panzers would arrive in time, that the Luftwaffe would rule the skies, that somehow, despite everything, the Reich would endure. They were wrong. The first sign came not from the beaches, but from the sky. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, thousands of Allied paratroopers descended over the Cotentin Peninsula and the Orne River Valley. German sentries heard the drone of engines overhead, low, rumbling, unending, and then the sky began to bloom with parachutes, white silk against black clouds, American, British, Canadian. They fell like seeds into French soil. Oberst Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heide, commander of the 6th Parachute Regiment, had anticipated this. His men were dug in around Carentan, waiting, but what he had not anticipated was the scale. Not hundreds of paratroopers, but thousands. Not a raid, but an airborne army. By dawn, entire platoons of German soldiers found themselves cut off, surrounded by Allied paratroopers who had landed in hedgerows and orchards and village squares. Radio communications broke down. Orders went unheard. The fog of war became a suffocating shroud. Then came the naval bombardment. At 0550 hours, the battleships opened fire. USS Texas, HMS Warspite, USS Arkansas. Their 16-inch guns hurled shells the size of automobiles onto the French coast. The sound was apocalyptic, a rolling thunder that shook the earth and turned the morning air into a physical force. German bunkers that had been poured with reinforced concrete, designed to withstand artillery, began to crack and collapse. Machine gun nests disappeared in columns of fire. Generalleutnant Dietrich Heiss, commander of the 352nd Infantry Division, watched from his command post near Bayeux as the coastal defenses disintegrated under the barrage. He had served in the Wehrmacht for 20 years. He had fought in the trenches of the First World War, but he had never seen firepower like this. It was not war, it was industrialized annihilation. And still, the officers believed they could hold. At 06:30, the landing craft hit the beaches: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The first waves of American and British infantry waded through chest-deep water under withering machine gun fire. Men fell by the hundreds. The surf turned red. On Omaha Beach, the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were pinned down for hours, taking horrific casualties. For a brief, bitter moment, the German defenders thought they might throw the invaders back into the sea. Officers like Major Werner Pluskat, commanding artillery positions above Omaha, watched through observation scopes as American soldiers crawled across the sand, dragging their wounded, dying in the surf. He felt something close to hope. Perhaps the Atlantic Wall would hold after all. But then the second wave arrived, and the third, and the fourth. By midday, it became clear the Allies were not retreating. They were not faltering. They were coming ashore in numbers that defied comprehension. Entire divisions, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles. Engineers were blowing gaps in the beach obstacles. Combat teams were clearing bunkers with flamethrowers and grenades. The sheer volume of men and material pouring onto the beaches was unlike anything the German defenders had encountered. Pluskat, watching from his command post, realized with a cold dread that this was not an invasion force. It was a migration, an entire nation crossing the Atlantic.
The problem was not courage. German soldiers fought with desperate ferocity. At Pointe du Hoc, they held out against American Rangers for 2 days. At Carentan, von der Haty's paratroopers turned every hedgerow into a fortress. At Sword Beach, the 21st Panzer Division launched a counterattack that briefly reached the sea. But courage could not overcome logistics. The Allies had spent years preparing for this moment. They had built artificial harbors, mulberry harbors, that could be towed across the English Channel and assembled off the coast of Normandy. They had laid underwater fuel pipelines, Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, to supply their tanks and trucks. They had stockpiled ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and vehicles on a scale that the German High Command had not thought possible. Every American infantry division that landed on D-Day brought with it more trucks than the entire German Sixth Army had possessed at Stalingrad. This was the truth that German officers began to grasp in the hours and days after the invasion. They were not fighting an army, they were fighting an economy. Generalfeldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, supreme commander in the West, sat in his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris, receiving reports from the front. Each one was worse than the last. The 352nd Infantry Division, shattered. The 716th Static Division, overrun. Coastal batteries silenced, communication lines severed, and worst of all, the panzers, the armored reserves that were supposed to throw the invaders back into the sea, were stuck. Not destroyed, not defeated, stuck. Allied air supremacy meant that any German unit attempting to move during daylight hours was bombed, strafed, and obliterated. The 12th SS Panzer Division took 5 days to move from Lisieux to Caen, a distance of less than 50 kilometers. Entire columns were caught on narrow roads and annihilated from the air. Von Rundstedt, a veteran of the Eastern Front, understood what this meant. Without mobility, armored divisions were useless. Without air cover, movement was suicide. The Allies did not need to defeat the panzers in battle. They simply needed to keep them from reaching the battlefield. On June 7th, Rommel returned from Germany, where he had been visiting his wife for her birthday. He had been assured by Berlin that the Allies would not invade during stormy weather. He had been wrong. Arriving at his headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, he reviewed the situation reports and knew immediately that the invasion could not be stopped. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, asked what orders should be given. Rommel stared at the map for a long time. Then he said simply, "We must hold them as long as possible. There is nothing else to be done." It was an admission of defeat, though he did not say the words aloud. The German officers who witnessed D-Day had expected a battle. What they got was a demonstration of what industrial democracy could accomplish when fully mobilized. The Allies landed 156,000 troops on D-Day alone. Within a week, they had put ashore 326,000 men, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies. By the end of June, the figure was over 850,000 troops. The logistical apparatus required to sustain this invasion was staggering. Every day, thousands of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies crossed the English Channel. American quartermasters tracked every crate, every gallon, every bullet. Nothing was wasted, nothing was left to chance. The German officers, many of whom had fought in North Africa and Russia, where supply lines stretched for thousands of miles and logistics were a constant nightmare, could not comprehend the efficiency of what they were witnessing. Captain Wilhelm von Gottberg, a staff officer with the 7th Army, later recalled standing on a hillside overlooking the invasion beaches in mid-June. The tide was out. The sand was covered, not with bodies, though there were still plenty of those, but with equipment. Trucks, jeeps, bulldozers, artillery pieces, stacks of crates marked with white stencils, fuel drums arranged in perfect rows, temporary roads made of steel mesh laid across the sand to prevent vehicles from bogging down, and everywhere men moving with purpose, building, unloading, organizing. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a factory. Von Gottberg turned to his commander and said, "We cannot win a war against a nation that fights like this." The symbolic object that haunted the German officers was not a weapon, it was a can. American rations came in small metal cans, K rations, C rations, each one stamped with production codes and expiration dates. Inside, meat, biscuits, cheese, chocolate, cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, instant coffee. Every American soldier carried enough food for 3 days. German soldiers, by contrast, often subsisted on black bread, ersatz coffee, and whatever they could scavenge. But it was not the quantity of food that disturbed the German officers. It was the casualness of it. American soldiers ate, threw away the cans, and moved on. The French countryside became littered with discarded American rations. Empty cans glinted in the hedgerows. German patrols would find them and study them like artifacts from an alien civilization. How could a nation afford to wrap every meal in metal? How could they produce enough food to feed millions of soldiers and still have surplus to waste?
Hauptmann Eberhard Wagemann, captured near Saint-Lô in July, was taken to a POW holding area behind Allied lines. He expected brutality. Instead, he was given a hot meal, beef stew, bread, canned peaches, real coffee, and a wool blanket. An American MP offered him a cigarette. Wagemann took it, smoked it, and felt something inside him crack. Not his resolve, not his loyalty, but his understanding of the war. Germany had been fighting for 4 years on the promise that the Reich was stronger, more disciplined, more capable than the decadent democracies. But here he sat, a prisoner, eating better than he had eaten in 2 years as a free man. The Americans were not weak, they were not soft, they were simply richer, unimaginably, absurdly richer. The transformation in perception came slowly and then all at once. In the days following D-Day, German commanders still spoke of counterattacks, of holding lines, of turning the tide. But in the quiet moments, in command posts at night, in conversations between officers who trusted one another, a different truth emerged. They had been lied to. The propaganda had been a fantasy. The Reich was not invincible. The Allies were not on the verge of collapse. And most damning of all, the German people had been told that they were sacrificing everything for victory, when in fact they were sacrificing everything for nothing. Rommel himself began to change. In private meetings with his staff, he spoke openly of ending the war. He made contact with conspirators planning to assassinate Hitler. He told his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, that Germany must seek peace before the Reich was destroyed completely. On July 17th, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British fighters near Saint-Froid-de-Montgomery. He was critically wounded, his skull fractured, his face torn open. He never returned to command. 3 months later, Implicated in the July 20th plot against Hitler, he was forced to take poison. He died believing that the war had been lost not in 1944, but years earlier, and that every death since had been meaningless. Other officers reached the same conclusion in different ways. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr division, watched his unit disintegrate under Allied air attacks in the weeks after D-Day. He had fought in North Africa under Rommel. He had seen the Afrika Korps ground down by British and American firepower. Now, in France, he saw the same script play out again. Overwhelming air superiority, endless artillery, waves of fresh troops. On July 25th, during Operation Cobra, American bombers carpet-bombed German positions south of Saint-Lô. Bayerlein's division was obliterated in a single afternoon, 70% casualties. He survived, stumbling through the smoke and rubble, and later wrote, "It was hell. The earth seemed to break apart. My front lines looked like a landscape on the moon." By August, the Allies had broken out of Normandy. The German 7th Army was encircled and destroyed in the Falaise pocket. Paris fell on August 25th. The officers who had stood on the cliffs of Normandy on June 6th, those who were still alive, now found themselves retreating toward the Rhine. The Atlantic Wall had not held for a day. The panzers had not thrown the invaders back into the sea. The Luftwaffe had not contended the skies. Everything they had been promised was ash. The can, the simple stamped metal can, became a symbol not just of American abundance, but of a deeper ideological defeat. The Nazi regime had built itself on the myth of German superiority, on the belief that racial purity and iron discipline would triumph over the weak, mongrel democracies of the West. But the men who fought at Normandy learned a different lesson. Democracy, it turned out, was not weak. It was terrifyingly efficient. A system that could mobilize millions of citizens, produce unimaginable quantities of material, and coordinate operations across oceans was not soft. It was powerful in ways that autocracy could never match. The Third Reich had turned Germany into a war machine, but America had turned itself into an industrial titan, and the gap between them was unbridgeable. Years later, long after the war ended, surviving German officers would write their memoirs. Many spoke of Normandy as the day they knew the war was lost, not because of a single battle, but because of what the invasion revealed. It revealed that Germany had been fighting not just against armies, but against the productive capacity of entire continents. It revealed that the Allies could afford to lose battles and still win the war, simply by virtue of having more men, more tanks, more planes, more ships, more food, more fuel, more everything. And it revealed that the Nazi ideology, for all its promises of strength and glory, had led Germany into a war it could never win. The epilogue of D-Day is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of systems. The German officers who stood on the cliffs of Normandy were not monsters. Many were professional soldiers fighting for their homeland, bound by duty and oath. But they served a system that valued domination over cooperation, conquest over prosperity, ideology over pragmatism. And when that system collided with a coalition of democracies capable of harnessing the full economic and industrial might of their populations, it shattered. The wind still blows across the cliffs of Normandy. The bunkers are still there, scarred and silent. Tourists walk the beaches, taking photographs, reading plaques. But if you stand very still, in the early morning when the fog rolls in from the sea, you can almost hear it, the distant rumble of engines, the drone of aircraft, the clatter of 1,000 landing craft hitting the surf. And somewhere, in the shadow of a crumbling farmhouse, the ghost of a German officer lowers his binoculars and whispers the truth that came too late. We were never going to win this.